Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and holiday weekend. Let me know how it went and what you guys did in the comment section below. Today we're officially finally starting chapter 2. I hope you guys liked the last one and got the chance to maybe go back and watch some of the other ones as well for those who are interested. Other than that, just for those who don't know, this is the Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kellner. Let's get into chapter 2. So think of inflation. Myth number 2. Deficits are evidence of overspending. Reality. For evidence of overspending, look to inflation. In 2015, I took a leave of absence from my job teaching economics at the University of Missouri Kansas City and moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as the chief economist for the Democrats on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. I thought it would be interesting to step outside the academic world where anything is theoretically possible and into the sausage factory, where budgets are formulated and spending decisions impact the lives of real people. I'm not sure exactly what I expected to find, but what I discovered was incredibly disheartening. None of the senators who sat on the powerful budget committee seemed to realize that the federal budget didn't work like a household budget. The top Republican on the committee was its chairman, Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming. Enzi had a background in accounting and had run a shoe sale business before getting involved in politics. He spent a decade as a state legislature serving in Wyoming's House of Representatives as well as its state senate. In all of these jobs, he operated under a constrained budget. As a businessman, he had to control costs, meet payroll, and turn a profit to remain viable. As a member of the Wyoming legislature, he operated in an environment where the governor is constitutionally required to submit a balanced budget each year. Before coming to Washington, he had only seen the world through the lens of a currency user. The committee held regular hearings and budget related matters, and I typically sat close behind Senator Enzi and the ranking Democratic member of the committee, Senator Bernie Sanders, who had hired me for the job. At the start of each hearing, the chairman would read aloud several minutes of prepared remarks. Senator Enzi's comments never changed much. He looked at the federal budget as if it was an income statement of it for his shoe sale business. To him, the problem was obvious. Uncle Sam was operating at a loss. Deficits and debts had become a way of life, and the whole thing was just plain irresponsible. You didn't need an accounting degree like Senator Enzi to see the problem. Time again, he would simplify the situation by declaring deficits are evidence of overspending. The economist in me wanted to leave from my chair. The chief economist in me was forced to sit quietly and hope that one of the other 21 senators on that committee had a background in economics. As we teach our first year students, excessive spending manifests as inflation. A deficit is only evidence of overspending. If it sparks inflation, since prices weren't accelerating, the deficit couldn't possibly be too big. To my great disappointment, none of the other senators challenged Enzi's claim. They were all using the same flawed lens and commenting on the need to match spending with receipts. Republicans saw too much on the expenditure side of the ledger, a spending problem. Democrats saw too little on the income side, a revenue problem. Everyone was convinced the deficit was too big. The argument was about whether to cut spending to match revenue or increase revenue to match spending. Kitchen table budgeting. What were they missing? Three big things. First, as we learned in the previous chapter, the currency monopolist doesn't face the same constraints as current users, households, businesses, or state and local governments. August 15, 1971 marked a major turning point in monetary history. President Nixon's decision to suspend dollar convertibility increased monetary sovereignty to the United States, forever changing the nature of the relevant constraint on federal spending. Under the Bretton Woods system, the federal budget had to be fairly tightly controlled to protect the nation's gold reserves. Today, we have a purely fiat currency. That means the government no longer promises to convert dollars into gold, which means it can issue more dollars without worrying that it can run out of the gold that once backed up the dollar. With a fiat currency, it's impossible for Uncle Sam to run out of money. Yet these senators were talking as if overspending could lead to bankruptcy. They needed to update their monetary lens. Second, the government's budget isn't supposed to balance. Our economy is. The budget is just a tool that can be used to add or subtract dollars from the rest of us. A fiscal deficit adds more dollars than it subtracts, while a fiscal surplus subtracts more dollars than it adds. MMT provides the evidence that neither outcome is inherently good or bad. It's a balancing act, and the goal is to allow the government's budget to move in ways that deliver a broadly balanced economy for the people it is meant to serve. Now, just one quick break. What she mentioned here is that, I mentioned this in previous videos, that the United States before the dollar, it relied on what? Gold and silver and other minerals for coins. Well, once we start issuing a US dollar, we said, hey, we want to back up that dollar with the price of gold and silver reserves. And over time, we relied so much on gold, which came from Africa and other nations like that. So for a long time, we had to say, hey, we have gold. Well, we want that to back up the US dollar so that we can still US dollar. Well, of course, I agree with Nixon. That's a stupid idea. We'll just make the US dollar our sole currency. So that's, kind of the little bit of history of what she's talking about. And finally, number 3. The federal government has historically almost always kept its deficit too small. Yes, too small. Evidence of a deficit that is too small is unemployment. Of course, MMT recognizes that deficits can also be too big. But Senator Enzi had it all wrong. A fiscal deficit is an evidence of overspending. For evidence of overspending, we must think of inflation. No one wants to live in a country where inflation gets out of hand. Inflation means a continuous rise in the price level. A bit of inflation is considered harmless and even something economists like to see in a healthy, growing economy. But if prices start rising faster than most people's incomes, it means a widespread loss of purchasing power, left unchecked. This would mean a decline in society's real standard of living. In extreme cases, prices can even spiral out of control, gripping a country in hyperinflation. There isn't just one way to think about inflation. There's not even just one way to measure it. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces a consumer price indices, CPIU and CPIW, a producer price index, PPI, and chained consumer price indices, CPI and U, among others. The Bureau of Economic Analysis generates a GDP, gross domestic product, price deflator, an index known as a personal consumption expenditure, PCE, and many more. The Federal Reserve prefers a measure known as core PCE. And well, you get the picture. Lots of statisticians are employed to produce a wide range of estimates to help policymakers, investors, businesses, unions, and others get a sense of what's happening to prices in our economy. We can look at a general sense of what's happening to prices because it's literally impossible to track what's happening to the price of every item that's for sale in our economy. You might find yourself paying more for your morning coffee, a gallon of gas, or your monthly cable, but that doesn't mean that the overall price level is accelerating. To understand what's happening at the macro level, we have to rely on price indices like those above. An index like the Consumer Price Index tells us whether the price of a standard basket of consumer goods and services is becoming more expensive over time. The basket includes everything from housing and healthcare to food, transportation, entertainment, clothing, and more. Obviously, not all households consume identical baskets of goods, so indices like the CPI are constructed to reflect the spending habits of a typical household. Expenses that eat up a bigger share of the typical household budget, for example, housing, count more, i.e., are weighted more heavily than items that are less important to the average family. Because housing is weighted more heavily than, say, entertainment, a 5% spike in the cost of housing will have a bigger impact on the CPI than an equivalent 5% rise in the cost of entertainment. In the real world, some categories of goods and services have gotten more expensive, housing, education, and healthcare, while others have become cheaper over time. What matters is how the overall price of the basket changes from month to month and year to year. and whether average earnings are rising fast enough to keep up with rising prices. People worry about inflation because it can eat away at the real standard of living. You might have no trouble affording the typical baskets of goods today, but if the price of that fixed basket starts rising, you may discover that you can no longer afford to buy it. It depends on what's happening to your income. If the price of the basket keeps going up by 5% each year, while your annual earnings just rise by 2%, then in real, inflation adjusted, terms you'll be 3% worse off each year. That means a real loss in terms of the actual amount of stuff, real goods and services you can afford to buy. So what causes prices to rise? And what can we do to prevent inflation from eroding our standard of living over time? Before we turn to these questions, it's worth noting that many of the world's major countries have been desperately trying to solve the opposite problem, underinflation, for a decade or more. Too little, not too much, inflation has plagued the US, Japan, and Europe. In each of these regions, 2% is officially considered the right amount of inflation. So that's the rate the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and the European Central Bank have been trying to achieve. But none of them has been successful in bringing inflation up to a steady 2%. Japan has had a particularly rough time, fighting not just low inflation, but periodic bouts of outright deflation. A drop in the overall price level, a rare phenomenon that gripped the U.S. during the Great Depression of the 1930s. You might wonder why anyone would worry about inflation getting too low. It sounds great. Yet economists worry because when there's little or no inflation, it's usually considered a reflection of weakness in the broader economy. The long battle against low inflation is considered a puzzle by most economists. Some argue that a combination of factors is probably responsible for low inflation across much of the world. Many believe rapid improvements in technology, demographics, and globalization probably explain the phenomenon. Others believe central banks simply haven't used their toolkits aggressively enough. They think inflation has been stubbornly low because people at the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Federal Reserve haven't done enough to create a different psychology so people continue to expect inflation to remain low. For this group, raising actual inflation is simply a matter of getting people to raise their inflation expectations. As central banks can convince people that inflation will move higher, people will begin spending more money today. So why wait to buy something if prices are heading up? And then added the demand will actually move prices higher. Still others see inequality and wage stagnation as a key driver of slow growth and de minimis pressure on wages and prices. Some say wage growth and a more equitable distribution of income would help booster demand among lower and middle income households, thereby helping to create some inflationary pressure. No one knows how long the current bout of low inflation will last, or what will eventually give rise to higher prices. Economists typically distinguish between cost punch and demand pull drivers of inflationary pressures. As Texas Christian University economist John T. Harvey puts it, cost push inflation can happen because of, quote, acts of God, or, quote, acts of power. For example, a serious drought could lead to massive crop failures and food shortages that send prices soaring as supplies collapse. Or powerful storms could wipe out oil refineries, causing the price of energy to spike. A sustained increase in food and energy costs, which feed directly into the CPI, can therefore set off an inflationary process. Prices could also increase when workers get enough bargaining power to bid up their wages. To prevent the increase in wages from squeezing profit margins, businesses may pass these costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. As the battle over income shares rages back and forth, it can set off a wage price spiral that results in accelerating inflation. Companies with enough market power can also unilaterally raise prices in a quest for greater and greater profits. For example, pharmaceutical companies that can enjoy patent protections can raise the price of prescription drugs, adding to the overall healthcare cost, which then feed into inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when businesses raise prices due to changes in buying habits. Most often, and happens when people are spending faster than the economy can churn out new goods and services. Think of it this way. Every economy has its own internal speed limit. It's only possible to produce so much at any point in time. Given the real resources, people, factories, machines, raw materials available in that moment. During a recession, people lose jobs and companies turn off machines and allow them to sit idle. In that environment, spending can safely increase because workers can be rehired and machines can be brought back online to produce more output. That's why the $787 billion fiscal stimulus passed in 2009 didn't cause an inflation problem. The Great Recession left millions unemployed, and businesses operating fell below their productive capacity. When there's that much slack in the economy, it's easy for businesses to increase supply in response to more spending. It's easy for businesses, but as an economy moves closer to its full employment limit, real resources become increasingly scarce. Rising demand can begin to put pressures on prices, and bottlenecks can develop in industries that are experiencing the greatest strain on capacity. Inflation can heat up. Once the economy hits this full employment wall, any additional spending, not just government spending, will be inflationary. That's overspending, and it can even happen if the government's budget is balanced or in surplus. Another common way to think about inflation is closely associated with the economic doctrine of monetarism. The father of this approach is Nobel Peace Prize winning economist Milton Friedman. Monetarism dominated economic thinking in the 1970s, and versions of the monetarist canon still permeate debates today. According to Friedman, quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. What he meant was that too much money is the culprit in any inflationary episode. If prices weren't stable, it's because the central bank was trying to force the economy to create too many jobs by allowing the money supply to increase too rapidly. Before Friedman came along, Keynesian thinking dominated macroeconomics. Keynesian economists believed that expanding the money supply was a perfectly legitimate tool for central banks to use in pursuit of low unemployment. More money would mean more spending, which would mean businesses need to hire more workers and produce more output to satisfy higher demand. Unemployment would fall, and the possibility of inflation would increase as more hiring led to higher wages and prices. You got more of something, good jobs, at the cost of something bad, inflation. It was up to the central bank to decide how to exploit this trade-off over time. Friedman challenged the Keynesian paradigm. In his view, a certain amount of unemployment is basically impossible to eliminate. He called it the, quote, natural rate of unemployment. The central bank could fight against the natural rate, but it would be fighting a losing and increasingly costly battle. Friedman's argument against the Keynesian was that the workers would find themselves in a continual trap, with excessive growth in the money supply causing inflation to rise faster than paychecks. Workers would end up working, i.e., the unemployment rate would fall. For lower real pay, eventually they would figure this out and demand better compensation, but the whole thing would end up in tears. As inflation would spiral higher, while unemployment would return to its, quote, natural rate, as companies choose to shed workers rather than boost paychecks. The takeaway was simple. Keynesians were offering a devil's bargain. Trying to hold the unemployment rate down would simply condemn you to a world of accelerating inflation. The only solution was to tie the hands of macroeconomic policy makers. Instead of giving the Federal Reserve discretion to trade lower unemployment for higher inflation, the central bank should be forced to accept the fact that a certain amount of unemployment was necessary to keep inflation stable. As we will see, MMT contests this framework, and it does. So that little section was called Common Ways of Thinking about Inflation. The next one is How We Fight Inflation Today. Since 1977, the Federal Reserve has operated under what is commonly referred to as dual mandate from Congress. The dual mandate directs the Fed to pursue maximum employment and stable prices. Basically, Congress puts the Fed in charge of jobs and inflation. Congress doesn't tell the Federal Reserve how many jobs it's expected to support or how much inflation is considered too much. The central bank is treated as independent in the sense that it gets to pick its own inflation target and decide for itself what maximum employment means. Like most central banks, the Federal Reserve has chosen a 2% inflation target. To keep from overshooting that rate, the Fed aims to keep just the, quote, right amount of unemployment in the system, much like Freeman just prescribed a half a century ago. The Federal Reserve can't spend money directly into the economy, and it can't tax money out of the economy either. Those powers are reserved for the fiscal authority, Congress. So how is the Fed supposed to deliver on its dual mandate? There was a time in the late 1970s and early 80s when many central banks, including the Federal Reserve, claimed that by directly controlling the growth of the money supply, they could control inflation. Today, virtually all central banks have adopted a different approach, targeting a key interest rate that is supposed to help them indirectly. Manage inflationary pressures. The idea is that by influencing the price of credit, that is, how much it costs to borrow money, the central bank can regulate how much money consumers and businesses borrow and spend into our economy. When it lowers its policy rate, the central bank is said to be easing credit conditions. They do this when they think the jobless rate is above the so-called natural rate of unemployment. The goal is to bring the unemployment rate down. If everything works as intended, lots of people take out loans to purchase things like homes and automobiles, and businesses borrow to invest in new machines and build new factories. All of this borrowed money gets spent. The economy picks up and more people find jobs. With fewer people out of work, the labor market is said to tighten, causing wages to rise and with them the risk of wage price inflation. And there's the rub. The Fed subscribes to the idea that if it induces too much spending, the market will get too hot and unemployment will dip below its quote natural rate, causing inflation to accelerate. This is exactly what conservative economist Marvin Goodfriend had in mind when he warned in 2012 that if the Fed allowed the unemployment rate to dip below 7%, it would, quote, give rise to a rising inflation rate in the next few years, which would be just as disastrous for the economy. But Goodfriend was wrong. 3 years after his warning, unemployment had dropped to 5%, yet inflation was lower than it was when he made his initial predictions. Why did he, and others, get it wrong? One problem is that the natural rate of unemployment, if it exists at all, isn't something the Fed or anyone else can observe or even calculate. The natural rate can change over time, but there's only one unique natural rate at any particular moment, and no one can tell you what it is. You discover it by trial and error. You found it when any further decline in unemployment causes inflation to accelerate. In other words, whether or not an economy is at its natural rate of unemployment is a conclusion drawn after the fact. In that respect, reaching the natural rate for economists is sort of like falling in love for the rest of us. You rarely see it coming, but know it when it happens. Economists have a name for it. They call it the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. Sexy, isn't it? To understand how it works, think of the classic children's story, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Darcy plays porridge with unemployment, and you basically have it. Whenever the unemployment rate is too cold, the Fed lowers the interest rate, hoping to warm things up by inducing more borrowing and spending. When it gets too hot, the Fed raises the interest rate, hoping to cool things off by discouraging further borrowing and spending. Hence, the solution is to keep adjusting monetary policy back and forth so that the unemployment rate stays just right. But there's a wrinkle here. The Fed doesn't like to wait until inflation becomes a problem before acting. Instead, it prefers to fight the inflation monster preemptively before it rears up its ugly head. As New York Federal Reserve Bank President William C. Dudley explains, quote, "We do not know with much precision how the low unemployment rate can go without prompting a significant rise in inflation. We do not directly observe the non-accelerating rate of unemployment of NIRU. Rather, we only infer it from the response of wage, compensation, and price inflation as the market tightens." End quote. In other words, the Fed watches the labor market for evidence that wages might be accelerating and interprets rising pay as a prelude to higher inflation. The idea is not to wait to see the whites of the inflation monster's eyes Shoot now and ask questions later. This kind of preemptive bias often leads the Fed to err on the side of over-tightening, rising the interest rate when it may be premature of a false alarm. Errors like these cause real consequences in the form of millions of people unnecessarily locked out of employment. The dual mandate framework is predicated on the belief that there's a delicate balance between too much employment and too little. It also assumes that the Federal Reserve has the ability to move the economy to its sweet spot, where just the quote right number of people are kept on the sidelines, wanting to work but trapped in unemployment for the sake of keeping prices in check. To put it crudely, the Fed uses unemployed human beings as its primary weapons against inflation. In theory, this is all pretty easy to do. In practice, well, that's another story. In theory, the Fed can use a mathematical model to determine exactly where to set the interest rate to keep the inflation rate stable. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed lowered the interest rate of all the way to zero and left it there. The unemployment rate fell from a peak of 10% in October 2009 to 5% by the end of 2015. More people were finding jobs, including many low-skilled and minority workers who often had the hardest time securing employment. In December 2015, the Fed raised its interest rate target from 0% to a quarter percent, even though the inflation rate remained below its 2% target. Over the next 3 years, the Fed raised its policy rate another 8 times. Despite persistently undershooting its inflationary target, some people criticized them for raising rates when inflation was clearly not expected to accelerate. But the Fed believed that rate hikes were justified to bring the unemployment rate back to its NAIRU estimates and preemptively keep inflation at bay. Although the Fed was trying to cool things off, unemployment continued to decline further below their estimates, and inflation didn't accelerate. According to the NAIRU framework, that wasn't supposed to happen. Despite the apparent breakdown in any relationship between low employment and inflation, the Fed remains committed to the NAIRU concept. Indeed, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell testified in July 2019 at a hearing before the House Committee on Financial Services that, quote, "We need the concept of a natural rate of unemployment," end quote. He continued, quote, "We need to have some sense of whether unemployment is high, low, or just right," end quote. Regardless of whether Chairman Powell is right or wrong, it is indisputable that the Fed's recent estimates of the NAIRU, the level of unemployment that can be achieved without causing inflation to accelerate, have been consistently wrong. This failure is put on full display in another exchange from the same July 2019 committee hearing, when newly elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posed the following question to Jerome Powell. AOC, the unemployment rate has fallen 3 points since 2014, but inflation is no higher today than it was 5 years ago. Given these facts, do you agree that the Fed's estimate of the lowest sustainable unemployment rate has been too high? Powell, absolutely. All right, guys, I'm going to have to end it here. I appreciate you all watching and hope you learned a thing or two. I do find this to be quite fascinating to see the comparisons of, household budgets to how the Federal Reserve works, to the power of the purse in Congress, to really people's way of thinking, politicians' way of thinking, economists' way of thinking, business people's ways of thinking, right? Especially those on Wall Street. And you get to really see the ins and outs of how some of these committees operate. And that, look, it's even happening today. Oh, we can't pass this budget because it's too much in the debt deficit, when, according to MMT and really how the power of Congress works, it doesn't matter. Like, the debt deficit literally does not fucking matter at all. The only key thing we have to look out for is inflation. And that's what she's talking about here. Even Jerome Powell, says in this book, like I just read, yeah, we're just printing money and we have to have some, quote, natural rate of unemployment. And yes, there's always going to be unemployment no matter what. Like, it's just something that's naturally going to happen. But go there and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did too. My plan is to have this book done sometime in early to mid-January. But our next book will definitely take us quite a while. Other than that, hope you all have a great day. If you're getting snow or any big winter storms, stay warm. And for those who are lucky not to see snow right now, like myself, enjoy it before it comes. And other than that, have a great day.